Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session of PyCon 2019. Our next speakers are presenting on account security patterns. Please make Philip James and Asheesh Laroia welcome.
Hi, we're Philip James and Asheesh Laroia. We like giving talks together, but right now you need to know that we have worked on a lot of websites, web applications in Python, and back-end API infrastructure things, often in Python. Some of them have been pretty good. Some of them haven't. We've spent a while staying on top of the best account security techniques because we know we've done it badly. This talk is a letter to our past selves. We're going to get right into it with the bad news. People who use your website are going to lose control of their accounts, and it might become your problem. Let me define using control of an account. If Asheesh here has an account on your website, and someone else can log into it without Asheesh's permission, something has gone wrong. If Asheesh permits someone else to use his account, that's out of scope for this talk.
Who are you? Hi, my name is Asheesh Laroia. I'm a systems engineer at Reduct, and I've worked on the security team back when Philip and I worked together at Eventbrite.
If Asheesh permits someone else to use his account, that's out of scope for this talk. With that said, I want to define account security. It's all the techniques that go into making sure that Asheesh is the only one who can access his account. We're going to focus on techniques that relate to that specifically. You're going to have to make sure your app doesn't have other really big problems, like remote code execution or cross-site request forgery or whatever. This talk could kind of be considered the precursor to the Django account security, to the Django security page, because all those things are great, but if people can get access to your users' accounts, they don't matter quite so much.
And if you want to learn more about the Django security tips and tricks, Philip and I gave a tutorial along with a bunch of other people a few years ago, and Jacinda Shelley gave a new tutorial based on that this year at PyCon.
But yeah, account security. We want you to get 3 big pieces of advice from this talk. Make it costly to take over an account, help your users stay informed, and empower your users to defend themselves. The reason to do these things is that it's a pretty scary place out there. The amazing thing about this montage, if you're looking carefully, is that all of these breaches happened in just the past year, and all of them involved account information being compromised. Each of these breaches increases the chance that one of your users' accounts has been taken over because people reuse email addresses and passwords for accounts. The main thing you can do to protect your users is to make it hard for other people to take over their accounts. Asheesh is going to start by talking about passwords.
So I've put here a list of the most popular passwords. Honestly, if one of your users uses 123456 as a password, their account is public. But it's still a really popular password. And to avoid these kinds of passwords, security people created the idea of password rules. Here's some special characters, here's some numbers. These rules, the most common rules, are inspired by a publication from the National Institute of Standards and Technology in 2003. And I recently read an interview with the guy who wrote that 2003 publication. Bill Burr is sorry. He was on a tight deadline in 2003 when he published that advice. It's okay, Bill. We can all get over it now. There's new rules out from NIST, published in the past couple of years, and they're primarily about picking passwords that aren't in common use. My favorite way to do that is to use a JavaScript library published by Dropbox. So here is the Python package index account creation form. I've entered 3 of those top 100 passwords. And the Python package index has a password strength meter at the bottom that prevents you from using them. They're using Dropbox's open source library called ZXCVBN. And by the way, if you're curious where this name comes from, take a look under ASDF on a QWERTY keyboard. So ZXCVBN checks if a user's password is in the top 30,000 most common passwords based on websites that got broken into. It's JavaScript, so you can stop the user before they even submit their bad password to you. There are some other goodies in that NIST publication. I actually met someone from NIST earlier today at the conference. Anyone from NIST here? OK, well, that's fine. But there are some other goodies in that NIST publication, and I really recommend searching for it. The most important aspect is asking users to use uncommon passwords, and ZXCVBN can help in the JavaScript front end. I also want to talk about back-end password strength validation. So Troy Hunt runs a free website and API called haveibeenowned.com. He publishes a list of SHA-1 hashes of passwords that he has found in breaches, along with email addresses of the accounts involved. So there's an email input right there on this website. In a perfect world, your users are searching for their email address in this box on this site. But chances are they are not. There's also an outrageously good chance that they're using the same password across multiple sites. Since Troy only publishes SHA-1 hashes of passwords, you can't really loop across your user database checking people's password against Troy's dataset. I'll show you something you can do. You can send the password to the Have I Been Owned API. When the user is setting their password, you have the raw password, and you can check then. Have I Been Owned operates a security-conscious API for free, where you can send the first 5 characters of the SHA-1 hash of the password to them. And they respond with SHA hashes of passwords that have showed up in breaches. If you don't want to query an API, you can also download the full database for free, which is about 11 gigabytes compressed. PyPI and other sites use the Have I Been Owned API. By the way, Django's built-in user system uses the same approach in an offline way. It bundles a list of the top 30,000 passwords as of Django 2.1. If you want to use the Have I Been Owned API, there are 2 options for integrating with Django. Here are the 2 projects, and a third thing you can do is read the source code to the Python package index. It uses Pyramid, and it integrates directly with the Have I Been Owned API, and it should be straightforward to figure out how to map that to Django. So strong passwords are a factor in account security, but they're only one factor. You can add more factors to account security, and Philip will tell you about that.
I love this picture. If I were in a caption contest for this picture, I would say, this is a picture of two-factor authentication. Most of you in this room probably already know about two-factor or multi-factor authentication. It's where you as the application maintainer tell the user they need something more than their password to log in, like an access code from a phone. I'm going to talk about different ways people set up multi-factor authentication. Before I proceed, I want to briefly note that MFA is harder to phish, but is still phishable. MFA is not a panacea against advanced phishing attacks. Sad but true. So the 2 main ways people set up multi-factor authentication is SMS or with an app. With SMS, you send them a short-term code, and they type it into your website. SMS is not free of cost to send, as anyone who has accidentally left a Twilio account running will tell you. This is Google Authenticator. It's an app that implements a standard alternative to SMS for two-factor authentication. Actually, how many people have used an app like Google Authenticator or Duo or Okta?
Wow.
Amazing, great. OK, good. How many people have set up an integration with it? OK, so not that many. That's OK, there are packages that can help you. The big thing to know is that app-based MFA is really just your server and the user's device agreeing on what number is going to be valid at what time. The app can generate the same number as the server, and you don't need to send an SMS. So that's pretty good. If you have users who want two-factor security, then you can set this up for them and not pay anything to Twilio. Sorry, Twilio. There's something else you can support for free, too. This is a picture of a security key by Yubico, which supports a standard called Universal Second Factor, or U2F. I bring it up because it's an alternative to asking people to pull out their phones and either get texted or open an app. Google has eliminated corporate account takeover using U2F devices. The main thing to know about U2F is that the browser sends the domain name to the U2F device, and it's therefore more resistant to phishing attacks. Setting up U2F involves creating a certificate, so it's a bit more hassle than TOTP, which is the app-based method, but it's still pretty doable. Also, your users have to buy a security key, or you have to send them one, so you'll have to take that into consideration. At this point, I'm just going to give you a list of resources. You can write these down if you want, but we'll also be posting the slides online. U2F is the coolest, and it's resistant to phishing, but it requires your users to buy a little hardware token or you to buy one for them. Two-factor authentication is one way to secure accounts, even if the password isn't super secure. Asheesh will now talk about another way.
So here's how Slack asks users to log in. A user gets an email, they click a link, the app finds an unforgeable token in the URL, and the app logs the user in. Slack is betting that their users and their users' email providers care more about their account than their Slack passwords. And I think this is pretty interesting because Slack is really leaning on email providers to help prevent account takeovers. For all the Slack users with Gmail accounts, they're asking Google to be the first line of defense against Slack account takeover. Slack is betting that the Google security team is really good at protecting Gmail, and that's probably a pretty good bet for you to make, too. To me, this fits into the pattern of make it as costly as possible to take over an account. The attacker's cost now includes the cost of breaking into the user's email account. Slack does also have a username and password prompt. I think they don't want you to use it, though. I think Slack wants to be sure that you control your email address at the time of login. So I'll talk about how to implement that. If you use Django, there's a Django package that does this for you. You can just use it. It's called Django token auth. If you want to implement this yourself, I have a fancy trick we used at Sandstorm that I want to tell you about. You can store when you're generating a random token, instead of storing the random token you email the user, you can store a hash of that token in the database. This gives you one tiny useful thing, which is that if somebody runs off with your database, they can't use the data from the database to log in as people. One thing to know about data storage, if you're going to be querying for these, and you are, because people are going to be logging in with those links, you might want to know that the databases do fancy tricks to save space in their indexes, and most of those tricks won't work for random data. So you might end up with an index that's the same size as your database table. That's just life. By the way, does this approach freak anyone else out? I used to be really bothered by this email login thing. And then I realized it's basically the same as doing a password reset. So I guess it's OK. Besides, you have to remember that your users, by and large, have pretty bad passwords. There's a lot more we could say about making it costly to take over an account. And it could be a whole talk on its own. But there are other aspects of account security that I want to make sure we cover.
So once you've done the first pass on making accounts hard to take over, your next step is to help your users help themselves. This section could also be called Building Your Users' Trust in You. Here's a login alert from Facebook. How many of you have seen one of these before? Cool, most of the room. Facebook and Google are really good at proactively letting the user know when something weird is happening. They send emails. They also show in-app notifications. Here's a web notification. When I get these notifications, what I feel is a big ball of trust that Google or Facebook are at least paying attention to what's going on with my account. Google and Facebook don't always send you a notification. They try to detect when it's most likely that a new login is a bad one. So here's some code to check if the user is logging in from a new IP address. It's based in Django. It's pretty simplistic. You're using the Django signals here. And we're also checking that the user's last IP address is the one that they normally log in from. We've added that to our user model in this case. We can send an email when we detect that there's a login that seems suspicious. You could detect, instead of last IP, you could detect the user country changes, or when they're on a new web browser. Anything that you know about the user or the session, you can use to detect if it's a bad, or at least a suspicious, login. Once you've unlocked the power of comparing information about logins and sessions, the world is your oyster. This pattern we've just implemented can be reused for all sorts of events that your users would like to know about, like, for instance, password changes. If an attacker broke into a user's account and changed the password, it's going to be really important for that person to get the problem resolved fast. Since we still live in an age where there's no common replacement for passwords, you as the app maintainer should do everything you can to let your users know when their password changes. Slack-style email login makes passwords less critical, which is good, but it doesn't negate you needing to protect the user's password and letting them know when it's changed. So here's some example code. I'm not going to explain it line by line, and again, we're going to publish these slides later. We haven't tested this exact code in production, so your mileage may vary. But the Django model, which is a replacement for the user model, saves the password at the moment that the object is initialized from the ORM, and then compares that to a password being changed, and then sends a notification if the password has changed from when it was initialized from the database. Hopefully that's straightforward. If not, feel free to come talk to us afterwards. As an aside, here's a picture of mint.com asking me for my bank password. I bring this up because if you build a useful website, others might want to integrate with it. Users are going to hand out their password if you're not careful. This is why people make OAuth APIs, so that a user can hand over an API token instead. If the API token gets compromised, it's easy enough for a user to revoke it or for you to revoke it for them.
There's something else you can do that shows users you're looking out for them. You can notify them of breaches in general, even if they aren't necessarily related to your site. So remember all these breaches. Troy Hunt's Have I Been Owned database lets you query users' email addresses to see if they show up in any of these breaches. And we've talked about have I been owned earlier. There's one other thing you can do to integrate. If you have the account details from the other site's breach, you can check for a match for email addresses that have accounts on your site. Letting users know when they could be affected by another breach is the highest level of informing and enabling them. But it's also potentially the riskiest. And if you're not sure why that would be, you can ask Phil about it in the hallway track.
Check with your legal team.
We've talked about a few ways to present information to users to help them know what's going on with their accounts. And I want to close with some specific ways you can help your users act on that information. So here's a picture of what it looks like when I change my Facebook password. Facebook gives the user the option to log out the other devices that are logged in. You could create a session database table, create a web interface for letting the user invalidate sessions one by one, and that would let you do something similar. But that feature can be hard to implement, and users might not go looking for it. There's a simpler approach. If the user changes their password, they might be worried somebody else has the old password. So it can be a good idea to log the attacker out. And in 2012, Durley Rodriguez asked on the Django user mailing list how to invalidate active sessions after a password change. Durley implemented it himself and shared the code. Then Albert turned it into a reusable Django app. And for Django 1.7, Tim Graham implemented the same algorithm that Albert and Durley used. The idea is to store an HMAC of the user's hashed password in the session. Since Django doesn't always have a database table with all sessions, Django can use this algorithmic approach to make sure that past sessions are invalid in the future. That is, if the user's current HMAC password doesn't match what's in the session, then you should log out this session. So being able to muck with sessions is a pretty powerful security tool, and there's an advanced technique that builds on it. But first, let me ask you all a question. How many people here are logged into GitHub on your laptops right now? Yeah, OK, cool. Now, how many people have ever intentionally logged out of GitHub? OK, good, some. And I said that I want to help limit the amount of damage that can get caused when an account gets compromised. And if you logged into your GitHub account, let a friend use your laptop, when the friend visits GitHub, they can probably do a lot of damage. So here's a picture of what GitHub calls sudo mode. They ask you for your password, again, when you're doing something sensitive, like adding a new SSH key. And I want to talk about how to implement this in Python web apps that you all might have. So there's the question of what your code might look like. Let's say you have a Django view that does something dangerous like this. You've got this giant account upgrade button. You might want to let the user click it to get a upgraded account of some kind. And maybe it requires login. So here's the Django view code for that. Now, this might be a thing you don't want to let them do unless they've logged in recently. And so I'll enhance this code in a pseudocode kind of way to add a sudo mode check. What that'll do is when the user clicks the button, it'll make a post request to /upgrade, and the server will detect that the user needs to re-authenticate. Here, you can see in our made-up page that we ask the user for their password, and we explain why we're asking for it, this sudo mode thing. We'll need to store the URL they need to go back to once they've confirmed that they're logged in, once they've confirmed their password in the URL. I think we should send them back to the account page so they can finish their upgrade thing. And we also add a query string parameter reason so that you can add some template information to the sudo mode page. So that's what it looks like from the user perspective. Here's some quick pseudocode for sudo mode. I'm skipping some decorator magic here. And I'm assuming you have a session system. Django's works fine. And here's how it goes. You check when the user was last authenticated. And if it's in the right amount of time, you let it happen. And otherwise, you redirect them. So to wrap up, sudo mode, also known as elevated privileges mode, lets you limit the damage if a user lends their laptop to a friend or other situations where someone loses control of their account. You can find an implementation of this in an open source package called Django Elevate, if you want. And basically the reason you're doing this is you don't trust your users to log out. There is a permanent logout, however, that Philip will tell you about.
A funny thing about popular websites is that people start asking for their accounts to be deleted. Sometimes people want their personal data to be visible online in fewer places. Other people want to know no one is going to break into their account. Whatever the reason, if an account is deleted, that's pretty secure. You don't have to hard delete the data, depending on your jurisdiction and some GDPR stuff. If no one on the internet can log into the account with its correct username and passwords, that's pretty good, and that's the most secure account. So with that, we want to close. Remember the 3 big pieces of advice that we want you to get from this talk. Make it costly to take over an account, help your users stay informed, and empower users to defend themselves. If you remember these 3 things, the techniques we described are hopefully easier to remember, and you'll find it easier to come up with techniques that work best for your app. And with that, we'll open it up to questions in the form of a question. You can either ask questions now, or you can find us in the hallway afterwards. Thanks.
If people have questions, there are microphones in the aisles here. Otherwise,
We blew them away. We answered every possible question about account security.
Oh,
Oh, no,
we
okay,
didn't,
great. Oh, there's one.
Testing. So do you have any thoughts on login methodology around like point-of-sale systems where you need to log in very quickly and have a very short-lived, unprivileged session or something like that? Thank you.
I can tell you one specific thing that I've seen. I'm blanking on the company name right now, but there's a company that makes tools for children. And to log in, the children are often like 4, 5, 6 years old and need to log in to a computer thing and can't necessarily type or read very well. And so they have the teacher puts out a list of QR codes in the classroom, and the student grabs theirs and puts it in the right place. This is to say, I think you even mentioned swiping something, but you can have a random token that is a QR code that a person actually does keep secret, unlike in the classroom example, and then they could put it in front of a camera, for example.
Well, you mentioned point-of-sale systems, and what I've observed, and we've also kind of worked for companies that have helped power point-of-sale systems to some degree, the way that I've seen them solve this problem, which I think is pretty reasonable, is every user of the point-of-sale system has like a password or an access code or some unique identifier for them that lets them access kind of the basic functionality that they need. But if there's advanced functionality that the business wants more protected, then someone who is a supervisor or has like effectively the sudo mode password comes in and has to like put in their password to do the operation. And so if you have a system where it's like, I know that there's going to be lots of users using this same terminal, this same computer over and over again, I think the answer there is like, limit how long a logged in session is valid for and like carefully evaluate all the actions for which ones might need like sudo mode. Question?
Do you have any suggestions about what to do when the user loses access to the email address?
Oh. Capture. So I've seen some companies, and credit card companies are actually kind of great at this in a roundabout way. They have the what's your call-in password, but another way they can kind of verify that it's you is they can ask you about like recent transactions. And so if you really think that your user has like lost their account, your support rep probably can see details about their account that theoretically only the user would know, right? Alternatively, valid second factor, right? Like if they've lost control of the email, but they still have access to their phone and the phone is still connected correctly, I would say that a valid second factor input is worth a password reset email, right? Like if they can prove that they have the second factor, then sending a password reset email to a new email system is probably no less secure than what you had previously. Cool, any other questions? Or have we solved account security forever? Great.
So much of your discussion focused on passwords, but with WebAuthn finally getting adoption, one of the promises of that is to eliminate passwords completely. Just curious your thoughts on that.
As I understand it, so I haven't been paying a lot of attention to WebAuthn. Can I actually keep you at the mic for a second? As I understand it, WebAuthn is a more standardized version of U2F. Is that right?
Yes.
And so the idea there is you can use something like the security key by Yubico that we showed, And then, like, basically, we love it. You know, there's this quote we have from this Google PR person about account security and how they've eliminated corporate account takeovers. I really think that this story by Google is part of what's rocketing WebAuthn and U2F and Ubico to success.
Yeah.
One other thing that I'd say there real quick is if your goal is, and we think this is a very valid goal, to get rid of passwords, then a combination of Slack-style login through email plus second-factor authentication is at least as secure as password plus WebAuthn, and probably more secure than password plus WebAuthn, right? And then the user doesn't have to remember anything. Yeah, it is two things they have instead of one thing they know and one thing they have, but it's still multiple factors.
The thing I love about it is it's invulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks, right? Because if you are, or I shouldn't say invulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks, although I think it is in some respects, but if you're phishing attacks in particular, right, it's
Right.
strongly tied
Cool.
to a particular endpoint.
Yeah.
And so you know that if you go to a site that
Yep.
looks like that, it's going to present a different credential than if you go to the real site.
Yeah,
Totally, thanks so much. Hi.
Hi, so what about third factor?
Well, so Philip carefully transitioned in the wording in the talk from saying, this is a photo contest of two-factor authentication. You've all heard of second factor or multi-factor authentication. So, like,
There's a point of diminishing returns,
I think
right?
that's true.
And like, a thing that I'll say there is biometrics are a username, not a password, just in case anyone was like under the illusion that like a biometrics, like your eyeball or your fingerprint should be a password. No, that is a username. There's still password is a separate thing. There are other factors you can add. At some point, you have to find that right balance between how much do I want my users to be secure and how much do I want my users to be annoyed. I think
Question about like
we'll round robin, so you and then you.
just a question about multi-factor authentication with like single sign-on. I wonder if there's sort of any implications that come with doing that, or if you treat it the same way as a username and password login.
So, I mean, the standard that I've seen a lot of companies adopting in terms of software, I know that both of Eventbrite and Patreon, which I currently work for Patreon, by the way. I forgot to mention that in the talk. We use Okta, which is single sign-on for all of the sub-apps, but is two-factor, multi-factor authentication to get into Okta. And so once you're inside Okta, there's kind of this like web of trust that you're in, and therefore they almost never make you do a second factor into the sub-app. But if you're going to do single sign-on, doing second factor is also still recommended.
Thank you.
I'm still confused from the first moments of the talk and wondering how I can establish that this is in fact Asheesh.
Well, so I'm wearing this jacket. It has my name on it, except the H lost a bit of a fragment there.
As Mies.
Yeah. I guess maybe I'm still failing that authentication check. It's my corporate uniform for the company I work for, Reduct.
We could go through his pockets if you want.
We can talk more afterwards. But it is impossible to know.
It's true. Okay, thanks. I think we're done. Feel free to come talk to us afterwards.